Hey y'all, tonight we're going to explore something that most people get completely wrong about Stoic philosophy. You're lying there in bed, maybe scrolling through your phone one last time, and you've probably seen those Instagram quotes about accepting what you cannot change plastered over sunset photos. But what if I told you that real Stoic acceptance, the kind practiced by ancient philosophers, is nothing like the passive, shoulder-shrugging resignation that modern culture sells you? Picture yourself standing in a storm, not because you have to, but because you've chosen to. The rain is soaking through your clothes, the wind is pushing against you, and instead of running for shelter, you're learning to dance with the chaos. That's closer to what the Stoics actually meant by acceptance, and tonight we're diving deep into the uncomfortable truths they never put on motivational posters. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how this community spans the globe, from midnight in Mumbai to sunset in Seattle. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've been taught that acceptance means giving up, that it's what weak people do when they can't fight anymore. But Marcus Aurelius, writing in his tent during brutal military campaigns along the Danube River, understood something different. When he wrote about accepting circumstances, he wasn't talking about becoming a doormat. He was describing the most radical act of personal power imaginable, choosing your response regardless of what life throws at you. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. True Stoic acceptance isn't about finding peace with easy situations. Anyone can accept a promotion, a sunny day, or a compliment. The real test comes when you're facing something genuinely awful: betrayal, illness, loss, failure, and you still choose to engage with reality as it is, not as you wish it were. Think about the last time something really difficult happened to you. Your first instinct was probably to resist, to fight against the reality of the situation. You might have spent hours, days, or even months in that mental space where you're arguing with what already happened. This shouldn't be happening. It's not fair. If only I had done something different. Sound familiar? The Stoics would say, you're wasting precious energy fighting a battle that's already over. But here's the twist that makes people uncomfortable. They're not asking you to like what happened. They're asking you to stop pretending it didn't happen so you can actually deal with it. Marcus Aurelius faced plague, war, political betrayal, and the death of multiple children. When he wrote about acceptance, he wasn't sitting in a comfortable library theorizing about hardship. He was covered in mud and blood, watching people he cared about die, dealing with senators who wanted him dead. His acceptance wasn't passive. It was the foundation that allowed him to keep functioning, keep leading, keep making decisions that affected millions of people. But here's something most people don't know about Marcus Aurelius. He was probably addicted to opium. Historians still argue whether his daily dose of theriac, a medicine containing opium that he took for stomach problems, was medicinal or recreational. But either way, even the most famous Stoic emperor wasn't handling his circumstances with pure philosophical fortitude. Sometimes acceptance includes accepting your own imperfect coping mechanisms. The uncomfortable truth is that Stoic acceptance often feels like betraying yourself. When someone you trusted hurts you, accepting that reality can feel like you're letting them off the hook. When you lose something important, accepting the loss can feel like you're dishonoring what you've lost. When you fail at something that mattered to you, accepting the failure can feel like you're giving up on your dreams. This is where most people get stuck. They think acceptance means approval, but the Stoics understood something more nuanced. You can accept that someone betrayed you without approving of betrayal. You can accept that you lost something precious without being glad it's gone. You can accept that you failed without deciding failure is good. The ancient Stoics had a phrase, the discipline of desire. It sounds like they're talking about wanting less, but they're actually talking about wanting differently. Instead of desiring that reality conform to your preferences, you learn to align your will with what's actually happening. It's not about becoming emotionless. It's about becoming emotionally intelligent enough to distinguish between productive and unproductive responses to circumstances. Here's a modern example that might hit close to home. You're scrolling through social media and you see someone you know posting about their amazing new job, their perfect relationship, their exotic vacation. Your first response might be envy, comparison, maybe even resentment. The typical advice would be to just be happy for them or focus on your own life. But Stoic acceptance goes deeper. You accept that seeing their success triggered something in you. You don't judge yourself for feeling envious. That's just what happened. But you also don't feed the envy by creating stories about how unfair life is or how they don't deserve what they have. You accept the feeling, examine what it tells you about your own values and desires, and then choose your next action from a place of clarity rather than reactivity. This kind of acceptance requires what the Stoics called prosoj, continuous attention to the present moment. It's exhausting at first because you're constantly catching yourself in the act of resisting reality. You notice how much mental energy you spend arguing with traffic jams, getting frustrated with slow internet, feeling irritated by other people's choices that don't affect you at all. The discipline of acceptance reveals how much of your suffering is self-created through resistance to circumstances you cannot change. But, and this is crucial, it also reveals where your real power lies. When you stop wasting energy on futile resistance, you have more resources available for effective action. Tomorrow, we'll explore how the Stoics distinguished between pain and suffering and why that distinction might be the most practical psychological insight ever discovered. But for now, let yourself settle into the radical idea that acceptance isn't giving up. It's the prerequisite for any meaningful response to difficulty. You're probably wondering how ancient philosophers sitting around in togas could possibly understand your modern problems. But here's something that might surprise you. The Stoics figured out a distinction about human suffering that neuroscience is only now catching up to. They realized that pain and suffering are two completely different experiences, and understanding this difference might be the most practical thing you learn tonight. Picture yourself stubbing your toe on the coffee table in the dark. There's that immediate, sharp sensation. That's pain. Your nervous system doing exactly what it's designed to do, sending urgent signals to your brain about tissue damage. But then something else happens. You start thinking about how stupid you are for not turning on the light, how this always happens when you're in a hurry, how your whole day is ruined now because your toe hurts. That's suffering. and it's entirely optional. The ancient Stoics called this distinction the difference between initial impressions and judgments. Epictetus, who knew something about pain, he walked with a limp his entire life, possibly from a leg broken during his time as a slave, taught that the initial impression is involuntary. Pain happens, loss happens, disappointment happens, but suffering, that's what we add to the experience through our thoughts about the experience. Here's where it gets interesting from a historical perspective. Epictetus was born around 50 CE in what's now Turkey, sold into slavery as a child, and somehow managed to become one of the most influential philosophers in human history. When he talked about the difference between pain and suffering, he wasn't speaking theoretically. He was teaching from a body that had been broken by circumstances completely outside his control. But here's a detail that might make you uncomfortable. Some scholars suggest that Epictetus's disability might have been the result of his master experimenting on him, testing how much pain a human leg could endure before breaking. Historians still argue whether this story is true or later embellishment, but either way, when Epictetus taught about accepting pain without adding unnecessary suffering, he was speaking from lived experience of the worst kind of powerlessness. You've probably experienced this distinction without realizing it. Think about the last time you had a headache. The physical sensation, the throbbing, the pressure, that's pain. But then your mind starts spinning. Why does this always happen when I have important things to do? I bet it's because I didn't drink enough water. What if this is something serious? I can't afford to be sick right now. Each thought adds another layer of suffering on top of the original pain. The Stoics discovered that while you can't always control the initial pain, you have tremendous power over the suffering you create through your mental response. This isn't about positive thinking or pretending pain doesn't hurt. It's about recognizing that most of your distress comes not from what's happening, but from your thoughts about what's happening. Let's get practical with a modern example. You lose your job unexpectedly. The initial impact, the shock, the fear, the uncertainty, that's like the pain of stubbing your toe. It's real, it's immediate, and it's completely natural. But then your mind starts creating stories. I'm a failure. I'll never find anything this good again. Everyone will think I'm incompetent. My family will lose respect for me. I'm too old to start over. Each story multiplies the original distress. The Stoic approach isn't to suppress these thoughts or pretend they're not happening. Instead, you learn to recognize them as mental events, not facts about reality. You might notice, I'm having the thought that I'm a failure rather than I am a failure. It's a subtle shift, but it creates space between you and your automatic mental reactions. Here's something most people don't realize about Stoic philosophy. It was developed by people dealing with genuine trauma and hardship, not comfortable academics theorizing about difficulty. Seneca survived political exile and eventually faced execution. Marcus Aurelius dealt with plague, war, and personal loss while running an empire. Epictetus lived through slavery and disability. When they talked about separating pain from suffering, they were sharing survival strategies, not abstract concepts. But there's a darker side to this teaching that modern self-help rarely mentions. Sometimes the line between pain and suffering isn't as clear as the philosophers made it seem. When you're dealing with chronic illness, systemic oppression, or ongoing trauma, the suggestion that suffering is optional can feel like victim blaming. The Stoics themselves struggled with this tension. Seneca, for instance, wrote beautifully about accepting hardship while living in enormous wealth and privilege. It's easy to philosophize about the voluntary nature of suffering when you have slaves to handle your daily needs and enough money to buy your way out of most problems. This contradiction doesn't invalidate Stoic insights, but it does remind us that philosophy always exists within specific social and economic contexts. The practical application of this pain versus suffering distinction requires what the Stoics called attention to the present moment. When you're experiencing difficulty, you learn to separate what's actually happening right now from your stories about what it means, what might happen next, or how things should be different. Try this the next time you're stuck in traffic. Notice the difference between the actual experience, sitting in your car, moving slowly, being later than planned, and your mental commentary about the experience. The traffic is just traffic. Your frustration, your worry about being late, your anger at other drivers, your catastrophic thoughts about how this ruins everything. That's the suffering you're adding to a neutral situation. This doesn't mean you become passive or stop trying to solve problems. The Stoics were remarkably effective people, precisely because they didn't waste energy on unproductive emotional reactions. When Marcus Aurelius faced a military crisis, he didn't spend time being upset that wars exist. He accepted the reality of conflict and focused his energy on strategy and leadership. The pain-suffering distinction also applies to emotional pain, which is often harder to recognize. When someone you care about treats you badly, the initial hurt is natural and unavoidable. But then you might start rehearsing the incident, imagining confrontations, creating elaborate narratives about their motivations, or generalizing from this one experience to conclusions about all relationships. Each mental replay intensifies and prolongs the original emotional pain. Understanding this distinction doesn't make you invulnerable to suffering. It makes you more skillful at recognizing when you're creating unnecessary additional distress. And sometimes just recognizing the difference is enough to interrupt the cycle. Tomorrow, we'll explore one of the most counterintuitive Stoic practices, deliberately imagining loss and disaster as a daily exercise. But for now, rest in the radical possibility that while pain is inevitable, much of your suffering might be optional. You're settling deeper into your pillow now, and I'm about to tell you about one of the most unsettling practices in ancient philosophy. While most people spend their mental energy trying to avoid thinking about bad things that might happen, the Stoics did the exact opposite. They had a daily practice called Premeditatio Malorum, deliberately imagining loss, disaster, and everything going wrong. And before you think this sounds like a recipe for anxiety and depression, let me explain why this counterintuitive practice might be exactly what you need. Picture yourself tomorrow morning going through your usual routine, but with one small addition. Before you check your phone, before you start your day, you spend 5 minutes imagining losing the things you take for granted: your health, your job, your relationships, your home. Not in a panicked, catastrophic way, but calmly, methodically, like you're preparing for a journey you know you'll eventually take. This isn't modern pessimism or anxiety management gone wrong. This is an ancient technology for building psychological resilience that the Stoics refined over centuries. Seneca, who lived through the reign of multiple Roman emperors and understood how quickly fortune could change, wrote about this practice as essential preparation for life's inevitable difficulties. Here's something that might surprise you about Seneca. He was one of the wealthiest men in Rome, possibly the richest person in the ancient world. His net worth in today's money would rival modern billionaires. Yet he regularly practiced imagining the loss of all his wealth, spending days living as if he were poor, eating simple food, and sleeping on hard surfaces. He wasn't being masochistic. He was training himself to remain psychologically stable, regardless of external circumstances. The practice works because of something psychologists now call hedonic adaptation. You get used to good things quickly and start taking them for granted. Your new car becomes just your car. Your promotion becomes just your job. Your relationship becomes just your relationship. This isn't a character flaw. It's how human psychology works. But it also means you're psychologically unprepared when good things disappear. Negative visualization counteract this adaptation by regularly reminding you that everything you have is temporary, not to make you miserable, but to help you appreciate what you have while you have it and to build resilience for when circumstances change. It's like cross-training for your emotional life. But here's where the practice gets uncomfortable and why most people avoid it. When you deliberately imagine losing someone you love, part of you feels like you're betraying them. When you imagine your health failing, it feels like you're inviting disaster. When you imagine professional failure, it feels like you're undermining your own confidence. These reactions reveal how much magical thinking influences your daily life. The Stoics understood that avoiding thoughts about potential loss doesn't protect you from actual loss. It just leaves you unprepared when loss inevitably occurs. Marcus Aurelius, who lost multiple children to disease and political violence, wrote extensively about the temporary nature of everything we hold dear. His meditations weren't morbid obsessions. They were practical preparations for the realities of human existence. Here's a historical detail that might make you uncomfortable. Infant mortality in ancient Rome was around 50%. Marcus Aurelius and his wife Faustina had at least 13 children, and only 5 survived to adulthood. When Marcus wrote about accepting loss and the temporary nature of all relationships, he wasn't philosophizing abstractly. He was processing real grief while trying to maintain the emotional stability necessary to govern an empire. Modern research supports what the Stoics discovered through experience. Studies show that people who regularly consider potential negative outcomes are actually more optimistic and better prepared for challenges than people who avoid such thoughts. Historians still argue whether this is because negative visualization builds genuine resilience or simply creates the illusion of preparedness. But the practical benefits seem clear either way. You can start this practice gently. Instead of imagining dramatic disasters, begin with small, temporary losses. Imagine your phone breaking and notice how that feels. Imagine your favorite restaurant closing. Imagine a friend moving away. Pay attention to your emotional response without trying to change it. You're not trying to become indifferent. You're trying to become familiar with impermanence. The practice reveals how much of your sense of security depends on things remaining exactly as they are right now. Your job, your health, your relationships, your living situation. You've built your identity and peace of mind around the assumption that these things will continue indefinitely. Negative visualization gently challenges this assumption, not to create anxiety, but to help you find stability that doesn't depend on external circumstances remaining static. Here's where it gets psychologically sophisticated. The Stoics weren't trying to eliminate attachment or become emotionally numb. They were trying to love people and enjoy experiences without the desperate clinging that turns love into possessiveness and enjoyment into addiction. When you regularly contemplate loss, you can appreciate what you have more fully because you're not taking it for granted. Think about how you feel about something you know you're going to lose soon. Maybe you're moving away from a city you love, or a friend is relocating, or you're leaving a job. Often, those final weeks or months are intensely meaningful because you're acutely aware of their temporary nature. Negative visualization brings that same quality of attention to experiences you normally take for granted. But there's a shadow side to this practice that the ancient texts don't always address directly. Sometimes imagining loss can become compulsive, a form of mental self-harm disguised as philosophical practice. Sometimes it can create distance in relationships because you're always preparing for their end. Sometimes it can justify not fully engaging with life because everything is temporary anyway. The key is intention. Are you practicing negative visualization to build resilience and appreciation, or are you using it to avoid vulnerability and connection? Are you preparing for potential difficulties, or are you rehearsing reasons to give up on what matters to you? The practice requires honest self-examination about your motivations. Seneca recommended combining negative visualization with its opposite, regularly appreciating what you have as if you were experiencing it for the first time. He called this seeing with fresh eyes. After imagining the loss of your health, you pay attention to the simple pleasure of breathing easily. After imagining relationship loss, you notice how it feels to have someone care about your day. The practice also works with positive experiences. Before a vacation, imagine it being canceled. Before a celebration, imagine it being disappointing. This isn't pessimism. It's psychological preparation that allows you to enjoy experiences more fully because you're not desperately attached to specific outcomes. Tomorrow, we'll explore what happens when your carefully constructed virtue feels impossible to maintain during genuine crisis. But tonight, let yourself experiment with the radical idea that imagining loss might be the key to appreciating what you have. Now, let's get real about something that doesn't get talked about nearly enough, especially not in the glossy, bite-sized stoicism you see on social media. What happens when you're trying your hardest to be virtuous, to do the right thing, to keep your cool, but life keeps throwing curveballs so fast and furious that all your carefully practiced philosophy starts to feel like a cruel joke? You've been there. You're exhausted, maybe even heartbroken. And suddenly the idea of just keep your virtue no matter what doesn't inspire you. It mocks you. You're not alone. Even the most dedicated Stoics had moments when maintaining virtue felt impossible, when the world seemed determined to test every ounce of their patience and resolve. Let's start with a little history. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, is often held up as the perfect Stoic. But let's not forget, he wasn't just writing in a quiet room. He was leading an empire through war, plague, and betrayal. He lost loved ones, faced enemies both foreign and domestic, and constantly had to make decisions that affected millions. And here's the thing, He didn't always get it right. He had advisors who lied to him, generals who failed him, and family members who disappointed him. There were times when even he must have wanted to throw up his hands and say, "Screw this, I'm done." So, what do you do when being virtuous, when doing the right thing, feels impossible? The Stoics had a word for this, prokopton, meaning someone who is making progress but isn't perfect. They never claimed that being a Stoic meant never failing, never losing your temper, never making mistakes. The real goal was progress, not perfection. Here's a quirky tidbit that might make you smile. The Stoics actually had a kind of philosophical buddy system. They believed that you couldn't practice Stoicism in isolation. You needed friends, mentors, even rivals to help you see your blind spots and keep you honest. Think of it as ancient group therapy, but with more togas and fewer couches. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, in the middle of a crisis, your virtue feels like a burden. You're supposed to be patient, but someone keeps pushing your buttons. You're supposed to be honest, but the truth could hurt someone you care about. You're supposed to be courageous, but you're just so tired. This is where the Stoics' advice gets really practical. They didn't say, just be virtuous no matter what. They said, when you fail, notice it and try again. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this in his private journal, reminding himself that even if he lost his temper or made a mistake, the important thing was to return to his principles as soon as he noticed his lapse. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Marcus Aurelius' own son, Commodus, turned out to be one of Rome's worst emperors, violent, vain, and reckless. Historians still argue whether Marcus could have done more to prevent this, or if he was simply powerless against the corrupting influence of absolute power. Either way, it's a reminder that even the most virtuous people can't control everything, especially when it comes to the choices of others. So, what do you do when you're in the middle of a mess and your virtue feels like just another thing you're failing at? The Stoics would say, pause, notice what's happening. Don't judge yourself for struggling, just notice. Then, when you're ready, try again. It's not about never falling. It's about always getting back up. Let's bring this into the modern world. Imagine you're at work and a colleague takes credit for your idea. Your first reaction might be anger, maybe even the urge to lash out. The Stoic approach isn't to suppress that feeling or pretend it doesn't exist. It's to notice it, accept it, and then choose your response. Maybe you talk to your colleague calmly. Maybe you let it go this time. Maybe you make a mental note to be more assertive in the future. The point is, you're not a failure for feeling angry. You're human. Here's something most people don't realize about Stoic virtue. It's not about being a saint. It's about being honest with yourself about your limitations and keeping your eyes on the long game. Sometimes, the most virtuous thing you can do is admit that you're struggling and ask for help. The Stoics also recognized that sometimes the world makes it almost impossible to be virtuous. If you're living in poverty or dealing with systemic injustice or facing discrimination, the idea of just focus on your own virtue can feel like a slap in the face. The ancient Stoics weren't blind to this. Epictetus, who was born a slave, knew firsthand how external circumstances could limit your choices. He taught that even in the most constrained situations, you still have some control over your thoughts and attitudes. But he never pretended that was easy. There's a phrase in the scholarly literature that captures this tension, the paradox of Stoic virtue. On one hand, the Stoics believed that virtue was the only true good. On the other hand, they recognized that real life is messy, and sometimes the right thing to do isn't clear. Historians still argue whether the Stoics were too idealistic or if their philosophy is flexible enough to handle real-world complexity. Here's a practical takeaway. When you're in the middle of a crisis and your virtue feels out of reach, remember that the Stoics expected you to struggle. They expected you to fail sometimes. The real test is whether you keep trying, whether you keep coming back to your principles, even when it feels impossible. Tomorrow, we'll look at why the Stoics deliberately sought out discomfort and how that might help you build resilience in your own life. But for now, give yourself permission to be imperfect. The fact that you're still trying is what matters. You're probably wondering why anyone would voluntarily make their life harder when the world already provides plenty of challenges. But here's something that would shock most modern comfort seekers. The ancient Stoics deliberately sought out discomfort as a regular practice. They called it voluntary discomfort, and it wasn't some masochistic ritual. It was sophisticated psychological training that prepared them for life's inevitable hardships. Picture Seneca, one of Rome's wealthiest citizens, choosing to sleep on the floor of his marble villa. Imagine Cato the Younger walking barefoot through the streets of Rome in winter, wearing only a thin tunic, while other senators wrapped themselves in expensive cloaks. These weren't publicity stunts or religious penances. They were deliberate exercises in building resilience and breaking attachment to comfort. The logic behind voluntary discomfort is surprisingly modern. When you're accustomed to having everything exactly as you like it, the perfect temperature, the right food, comfortable clothes, immediate entertainment, you become psychologically fragile. Any deviation from your preferred conditions becomes a source of stress and distraction. The Stoics realized that this kind of comfort dependence was actually a form of slavery. Here's a mainstream historical fact that puts this in perspective. Roman aristocrats in the 1st century CE lived with luxuries that wouldn't be available to most people for another 1,000 years. They had central heating, running water, glass windows, and access to foods from across the known world. Yet philosophers like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius regularly chose to live without these comforts as a form of training. But here's something that might make you uncomfortable. Cato the Younger, famous for his voluntary hardships, also owned hundreds of slaves. He would walk barefoot through Rome to demonstrate his philosophical commitment, while other human beings served his every need. Historians still argue whether this contradiction invalidates his philosophy or simply reflects the moral blind spots of his era. But it's a reminder that even the most dedicated practitioners of virtue can have massive ethical inconsistencies. The practice of voluntary discomfort works on multiple levels. First, it breaks what psychologists now call hedonic adaptation, your tendency to take good things for granted. When you occasionally sleep on the floor, you appreciate your bed more. When you sometimes eat simple food, you enjoy elaborate meals more fully. When you walk instead of driving, you're grateful for transportation. But there's a deeper purpose that goes beyond appreciation. Voluntary discomfort builds what the Stoics called spiritual strength, the ability to maintain your equanimity regardless of external circumstances. If you can be content while deliberately uncomfortable, you're less likely to be thrown off balance when discomfort is imposed on you by circumstances beyond your control. Let's get practical with some modern examples. You might try taking cold showers occasionally, not because you enjoy them, but because learning to stay calm and focused while uncomfortable builds psychological resilience. You might choose to walk or bike instead of driving sometimes, even when it's less convenient. You might eat simple, plain food occasionally instead of always seeking maximum flavor and satisfaction. The key is intention. You're not punishing yourself or trying to prove how tough you are. You're training your mind to remain stable when conditions aren't ideal. It's like cross-training for your psychological life, building strength and flexibility that will serve you when real challenges arise. Here's a quirky historical detail. Marcus Aurelius used to practice a form of voluntary discomfort by deliberately exposing himself to annoying people. He would spend time with individuals he found irritating, not to torture himself, but to practice maintaining his philosophical composure under social stress. Imagine deliberately hanging out with that one person who always gets on your nerves, just to build your patience muscles. The practice also reveals how much of your mental energy goes toward maintaining comfort and avoiding minor inconveniences. When you're willing to be occasionally uncomfortable, you free up psychological resources for more important things. You're not constantly monitoring your environment for potential sources of discomfort or spending mental energy trying to optimize every small detail of your experience. But there's a shadow side to voluntary discomfort that the ancient texts don't always address clearly. Sometimes it can become a form of self-punishment disguised as philosophy. Sometimes it can create unnecessary suffering or interfere with genuine self-care. Sometimes it can become competitive, a way of proving your philosophical superiority to others. The Stoics were aware of these dangers. Seneca wrote about the difference between useful voluntary discomfort and pointless self-torture. The goal isn't to suffer for its own sake, but to build resilience and break unhealthy attachments to specific conditions. If your practice of voluntary discomfort makes you more judgmental of others or proud of your own toughness, you're missing the point. There's also the question of privilege that the ancient Stoics didn't fully address. It's easier to choose discomfort when you know you can return to comfort whenever you want. If you're already dealing with involuntary hardship, poverty, illness, discrimination, the suggestion to seek out additional discomfort can feel tone deaf. The practice works best when it's truly voluntary and when you have genuine choices about your level of comfort. Modern applications of voluntary discomfort might include digital fasting, deliberately disconnecting from technology for periods of time, or financial fasting, living on a minimal budget occasionally to appreciate what you normally take for granted, or social fasting, spending time alone to build comfort with solitude and reduce dependence on constant social stimulation. The practice also applies to emotional comfort. Instead of always seeking entertainment, distraction, or stimulation, you might occasionally choose boredom. Instead of always avoiding difficult conversations, you might deliberately engage with challenging topics. Instead of always seeking approval and validation, you might practice being okay with disapproval or indifference. Seneca recommended starting small and building gradually. Don't jump into extreme practices that might harm your health or interfere with your responsibilities. Begin with minor inconveniences, taking the stairs instead of the elevator, drinking water instead of your preferred beverage, sitting on the floor instead of the couch. Pay attention to your mental response to these small discomforts. The goal isn't to become indifferent to comfort or to stop enjoying pleasant experiences. The goal is to become less dependent on specific conditions for your peace of mind. When you know you can be okay, even when things aren't perfect, you have more freedom to engage fully with life without constantly trying to control your environment. Remember that negative visualization practice we discussed earlier? Voluntary discomfort is its physical counterpart, actually experiencing small versions of the losses and inconveniences you've been imagining. It's the difference between thinking about being cold and actually being cold, between imagining hunger and actually being hungry. Tomorrow we'll explore the darkest application of Stoic philosophy, learning to love truly awful circumstances through Amor Fati. But for now, consider the radical possibility that occasionally choosing discomfort might be the key to genuine freedom. You're lying there in the darkness, and I'm about to tell you about one of the most challenging concepts in all of philosophy. It's called Amor Fati, love your fate, and it doesn't mean what you think it means. This isn't about finding silver linings or pretending everything happens for a reason. This is about learning to love circumstances that are genuinely devastating, unfair, and awful. And yes, the Stoics really expected you to do this. Picture the worst thing that's ever happened to you. Maybe it was a betrayal that shattered your trust, a loss that broke your heart, a failure that crushed your dreams, or an injustice that made you question everything you believed about fairness. Now imagine not just accepting that experience, but actually loving it as a necessary part of your story. That's Amor Fati, and it's probably the most uncomfortable teaching in Stoic philosophy. Nietzsche, who wasn't a Stoic but understood their ideas deeply, wrote about Amor Fati as the ultimate test of psychological strength. He asked whether you could live your entire life over again, experiencing every joy and every agony exactly as it happened, and still say yes to the whole experience. It's a thought experiment that reveals how much of your peace depends on editing your past, wishing things had been different. Here's a mainstream historical fact that puts this in perspective. Marcus Aurelius lost at least 8 of his 13 children to disease and political violence. When he wrote about loving fate, he wasn't theorizing about minor inconveniences. He was trying to find a way to embrace a reality that included watching his children die while maintaining the emotional stability necessary to govern an empire during plague and war. But here's something that might disturb you. Some historians suggest that Marcus Aurelius may have been complicit in the persecution of early Christians, including the execution of Justin Martyr and other Christian philosophers. If true, this means the most famous practitioner of Amor Fati was simultaneously trying to love his own role in causing suffering to others. Historians still argue whether Marcus was directly responsible or simply failed to prevent these persecutions. But either way, it complicates our understanding of what it means to love your fate. The practice of Amor Fati goes beyond acceptance. Acceptance says, this happened and I can't change it. Amor Fati says, this happened and I'm grateful it happened exactly as it did because it made me who I am. It's the difference between tolerating your circumstances and embracing them as essential to your development. This is where most people get stuck. and rightfully so. How can you love experiences that cause genuine harm? How can you be grateful for betrayal, abuse, loss, or failure? The Stoic answer is unsettling, because these experiences revealed strengths you didn't know you had, taught you lessons you couldn't have learned any other way, and shaped you into someone capable of deeper wisdom and compassion. But let's be honest about how this feels in practice. When you're in the middle of genuine suffering, the suggestion to love your fate can feel like spiritual bypassing at best and victim blaming at worst. If someone has harmed you, the idea that you should be grateful for that harm can feel like a betrayal of your own experience and dignity. The Stoics weren't naive about this tension. Epictetus, who lived through slavery and physical disability, never suggested that harmful experiences were good in themselves. Instead, he taught that your response to harmful experiences could become a source of strength and wisdom that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. The love isn't for the harm itself, but for who you became through surviving and integrating the experience. Here's a quirky detail that might help clarify this. The Stoics believed that the universe was fundamentally rational and interconnected, like a giant organism where every part served the whole. From this perspective, even apparently negative events were necessary for the overall harmony of existence. It's like loving a piece of music that includes dissonant notes, because you understand how those notes contribute to the beauty of the complete composition. Modern psychology has found some support for aspects of this teaching through research on post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon where people report becoming stronger, wiser, or more compassionate as a result of surviving difficult experiences. But this research also shows that growth isn't automatic or universal, and the suggestion that trauma is somehow good for you can be harmful to people who are still processing their experiences. The practice of Amor Fati requires a kind of temporal perspective that's difficult to maintain. You're not trying to love your circumstances while you're in the middle of acute suffering. You're developing the ability to look back on completed experiences, even painful ones, and recognize how they contributed to your development as a person. Let's try a gentle example. Think about a relationship that ended badly, maybe years ago. At the time, it probably felt devastating. You might have spent months or years wishing it had never happened, or that it had ended differently. But now, with distance and perspective, you might be able to see how that experience taught you important things about yourself, about relationships, about what you really value. Amor Fati would be the ability to say, I'm glad that happened exactly as it did, because it led me to where I am now. This doesn't mean you're glad the other person hurt you, or that you think harmful behavior is acceptable. It means you're grateful for your own growth through the experience, and you recognize that this growth might not have been possible through easier circumstances. The practice becomes more challenging when applied to ongoing difficulties or systemic injustices. How do you love your fate when you're dealing with chronic illness, financial hardship, discrimination, or other circumstances that continue to cause suffering? The Stoics would say that even these experiences offer opportunities for developing virtues like patience, courage, and resilience that wouldn't be possible in easier circumstances. But there's a dangerous edge to this teaching that needs to be acknowledged. Amor Fati can become a way of justifying injustice, avoiding necessary action, or accepting harmful situations that should be changed. If you're being mistreated, the appropriate response isn't to love your fate, it's to protect yourself and work for change. The key is distinguishing between circumstances you can change and circumstances you cannot change. Amor Fati applies to the unchangeable past and to present circumstances that are genuinely beyond your control. It doesn't apply to situations where you have agency and responsibility to act. Seneca practiced Amor Fati by regularly reviewing his life and looking for ways to be grateful even for his mistakes and failures. He wrote about being thankful for his periods of exile because they taught him about resilience and showed him who his true friends were. He was grateful for his financial losses because they revealed his attachment to wealth and helped him develop greater inner security. The ultimate test of Amor Fati is whether you can embrace your entire life story, including the parts you wish had been different, as necessary for becoming who you are. It's not about pretending that harmful things were actually good, but about recognizing that your response to harmful things became a source of strength and wisdom. Tomorrow, we'll explore the uncomfortable truth about how little control you actually have, even over yourself. But tonight, rest with the radical possibility that even your worst experiences might have contributed something essential to who you've become. You've probably heard the Stoic teaching about focusing on what's in your control and letting go of what isn't. It sounds simple, even obvious, but here's the uncomfortable truth that most people discover when they actually try to apply this principle. You have far less control than you think you do, even over yourself. And this realization can be either liberating or terrifying, depending on how deeply you're willing to look. Let's start with something basic. Right now, as you're listening to this, try to control your heartbeat. Speed it up, slow it down, make it skip a beat. You can't, can you? Your heart has been beating without your conscious input since before you were born, and it will continue until the day you die, completely outside your direct control. This is just the beginning of how little agency you actually have over your own existence. The Stoics divided all of existence into 3 categories: things completely within your control, things completely outside your control, and things partially within your control. But here's where it gets psychologically challenging. The first category is much smaller than most people realize, and the third category is much more complex than it initially appears. Epictetus taught that the only thing truly within your control is your prohairesis, your faculty of choice, your ability to give or withhold assent to impressions. But even this gets complicated when you examine it closely. Can you control which thoughts arise in your mind? Can you control your emotional reactions? Can you control your desires and aversions? The honest answer is only partially, and often not at all. Here's a mainstream historical fact that illustrates this complexity. Marcus Aurelius struggled with anger throughout his life, despite decades of philosophical practice. His private journals are filled with reminders to himself to stay calm, to not lose his temper, to respond rationally rather than emotionally. If the most famous Stoic emperor couldn't fully control his own emotional reactions after years of training, what does that tell us about the limits of human agency? But there's something even more unsettling that historians have uncovered. Marcus Aurelius may have suffered from what we would now recognize as depression or anxiety. Some scholars point to passages in his Meditations that suggest persistent negative thinking, difficulty sleeping, and a sense of existential despair. Historians still argue whether this was philosophical melancholy, or clinical depression. But either way, it suggests that even our thoughts and moods aren't as controllable as we'd like to believe. Let's get practical about this. You decide you're going to wake up tomorrow morning in a good mood, ready to tackle the day with enthusiasm. But you wake up feeling anxious, irritated, or sad for no apparent reason. Your biochemistry, your sleep cycles, your subconscious processing of recent events, all of these influence your mood in ways that bypass your conscious control entirely. Or consider your habits. You decide you're going to eat healthier, exercise regularly, check your phone less often. You have good intentions, you make plans, you start strong. But then you find yourself reaching for junk food, skipping workouts, scrolling mindlessly through social media. The gap between your intentions and your actions reveals how much of your behavior operates outside your direct conscious control. The Stoics understood this paradox better than most modern self-help approaches. They recognized that you can't directly control your thoughts, emotions, or even many of your behaviors, but you can influence them indirectly through practices, habits, and environmental changes. You can't force yourself to feel calm, but you can practice breathing techniques that tend to promote calmness. You can't eliminate negative thoughts, but you can practice not believing or acting on every thought that arises. Here's a quirky historical detail that might surprise you. The Stoics were among the first philosophers to recognize what we now call cognitive biases, systematic errors in thinking that affect everyone. They understood that human perception and judgment are inherently flawed, that we see what we expect to see and interpret events through the lens of our existing beliefs and emotions. This recognition led to what might be the most practical Stoic teaching, the discipline of assent. Since you can't control what thoughts and impressions arise in your mind, you focus on what you can influence, whether you believe those thoughts, how much attention you give them, and whether you act on them. But even this gets complicated. Can you really control whether you believe a thought? If you're walking alone at night and you hear footsteps behind you, can you simply choose not to feel afraid? If someone you trust betrays you, can you decide not to feel hurt? The honest answer is that your initial reactions are largely involuntary, influenced by factors ranging from your evolutionary programming to your personal history to your current biochemical state. The Stoic approach isn't to pretend you have more control than you do, but to work skillfully with the limited control you actually have. You can't control your initial emotional reaction to betrayal, but you can influence how long you dwell on it, what stories you tell yourself about it, and what actions you take in response. This is where the teaching gets both humbling and empowering. Humbling because it reveals how much of your experience is shaped by forces beyond your conscious control. Empowering because it shows you where your real agency lies, not in controlling outcomes, but in choosing your responses to whatever arises. Let's apply this to a common modern situation. You're stuck in traffic, late for an important meeting. You can't control the traffic. You can't control time. You can't even fully control your emotional reaction to the situation. But you can influence whether you spend the time catastrophizing about the consequences, whether you take your frustration out on other drivers, whether you use the delay as an opportunity to practice patience or to make necessary phone calls. The Stoics also recognize that your sense of control is often an illusion that provides psychological comfort. You make plans, set goals, try to manage your environment and relationships to create predictable outcomes. But life has a way of disrupting even the best laid plans. The stock market crashes, relationships end, health problems arise, natural disasters strike. Your sense of control was always partly fictional. This doesn't mean you should become passive or stop making efforts to improve your circumstances. It means recognizing that your efforts are inputs into a complex system with many variables you can't see or influence. You do your best and then practice accepting whatever results emerge, knowing that your worth and peace of mind don't depend on specific outcomes. Seneca wrote about this as the difference between preferred indifference and true goods. Health, wealth, reputation, and success are preferred indifference. You naturally prefer them to their opposites, and it's reasonable to work toward them. But your happiness and virtue don't depend on obtaining them. The only true good is your character, how you respond to whatever circumstances arise. But here's something that makes this teaching uncomfortable for modern people. It challenges the entire self-help industry's promise that you can control your life through the right techniques, mindset, or strategies. The Stoics would say that while you can influence your circumstances to some degree, ultimate control is an illusion that creates more suffering than it prevents. Tomorrow, we'll explore how Stoic philosophy approaches the devastating experience of loss without the comforting lies we usually tell ourselves. But for now, rest in the paradoxical freedom that comes from accepting how little control you actually have. You're settling deeper into sleep now, but I need to talk to you about something that every human being will face: devastating loss. And I'm not going to offer you the usual comforting platitudes about how everything happens for a reason, or they're in a better place now. The Stoics approached grief with a brutal honesty that most people find disturbing, but also with a practical wisdom that can help you navigate loss without drowning in it. Picture yourself receiving the worst possible news, the phone call that changes everything, the diagnosis that rewrites your future, the moment when someone you love is suddenly gone forever. Your first instinct is probably to resist the reality, to bargain with the universe, to search for someone to blame or some way to undo what's happened. The Stoics would say this is natural, but also the beginning of unnecessary suffering. Seneca lost his father, his brother, his infant son, and eventually faced his own execution on the orders of Emperor Nero. When he wrote about grief, he wasn't offering theoretical comfort. He was sharing survival strategies developed through direct experience with devastating loss. His approach was neither cold nor sentimental, but something more challenging, radically honest. Here's a mainstream historical fact that puts Stoic grief in perspective. Infant mortality in ancient Rome was so high that parents often didn't name their children until they survived their first week. Marcus Aurelius and his wife Faustina lost at least 8 children, and this was considered normal rather than tragic. When the Stoics wrote about accepting loss, they were addressing people who lived with death as a constant presence, not an abstract possibility. But here's something that might make you uncomfortable. Seneca wrote some of his most profound thoughts on grief while he was complicit in Nero's increasingly violent regime. He counseled others on accepting loss while participating in a system that created loss for countless families. Historians still argue whether this makes him a hypocrite or simply demonstrates how even wise people can compartmentalize their ethics. But it's a reminder that philosophical insight doesn't guarantee moral consistency. The Stoic approach to grief starts with a recognition that most of your suffering comes not from the loss itself, but from your thoughts about the loss. The person you loved is gone. That's the reality. But the stories you tell yourself about what this means, about how unfair it is, about how you can't go on without them, about how things should have been different, these stories multiply the original pain exponentially. This doesn't mean the Stoics advocated emotional numbness or pretended that loss doesn't hurt. Seneca wrote movingly about the natural human response to death, acknowledging that tears and sadness are involuntary and appropriate. But he distinguished between natural grief and what he called empty suffering, the additional pain we create through our thoughts about the loss. Let's be specific about what this looks like. When someone you love dies, the immediate pain of their absence is real and unavoidable. But then your mind starts generating additional suffering. I should have spent more time with them. I never got to say what I really meant. They were too young. Life is meaningless without them. I'll never be happy again. Each of these thoughts takes you further away from the simple reality of loss and deeper into a maze of mental suffering. The Stoic practice isn't to suppress these thoughts, but to recognize them as thoughts rather than facts. I'm having the thought that life is meaningless is different from life is meaningless. I'm having the thought that I'll never be happy again is different from I'll never be happy again. This subtle shift creates space between you and your automatic mental reactions to loss. Here's a quirky historical detail that reveals something important about Stoic grief. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about death and loss, but he also wrote about the importance of continuing to engage with life even while grieving. He didn't retreat from his responsibilities as emperor when his children died. He continued to govern, to make decisions, to care for the welfare of millions of people. His grief was real, but it didn't become his entire identity. The Stoics also practiced what they called premeditation of evils. Remember that practice we discussed earlier? When applied to grief, this meant regularly contemplating the temporary nature of all relationships, not to become morbid or detached, but to appreciate people more fully while they're alive, and to build psychological resilience for the inevitable experience of loss. But there's a shadow side to the Stoic approach to grief that needs to be acknowledged. Sometimes the emphasis on accepting loss and not dwelling on empty suffering can become a way of avoiding the full emotional impact of grief. Sometimes it can create pressure to get over it faster than is natural or healthy. Sometimes it can lead to spiritual bypassing, using philosophy to avoid feeling difficult emotions. The key is timing and intention. The Stoic practices for dealing with grief are most helpful after the acute phase of loss, when you're ready to examine your relationship with your own suffering. In the immediate aftermath of devastating loss, the most important thing might simply be to feel what you feel without trying to fix or change it. Modern research on grief supports some Stoic insights. While challenging others, studies show that people who can find meaning in loss and who don't get stuck in rumination tend to recover more fully. But research also shows that grief is more complex and individual than the Stoics sometimes suggested, and that there's no right timeline for processing loss. Let's apply this to a contemporary example. You lose your job unexpectedly, and it's not just any job, it's work you loved, that gave your life meaning, that was central to your identity. The immediate shock and disappointment are natural and unavoidable, but then your mind starts spinning stories. I'm a failure. I'll never find anything this good again. My career is over. People will think less of me. Each story adds layers of suffering to the original loss. The Stoic approach would be to notice these stories without believing them automatically. You might observe, I'm telling myself that my career is over, but I don't actually know what opportunities might emerge. I'm assuming people will think less of me, but I have no evidence for this. I'm catastrophizing about the future based on one event. This doesn't mean you pretend the loss doesn't matter or that you should immediately feel positive about it. It means you separate the facts from your interpretations, the actual loss from your stories about what the loss means. This creates space for more skillful responses, updating your resume, reaching out to contacts, exploring new possibilities, rather than getting stuck in rumination and despair. The Stoics also recognize that attachment itself creates the conditions for suffering. The more tightly you cling to people, circumstances, or identities, the more you suffer when they change or disappear. But they weren't advocating detachment in the sense of not caring. They were advocating what we might call engaged non-attachment, loving fully while holding lightly. Seneca wrote about loving his friends and family completely while always remembering that they were on loan from fate. This wasn't cold or calculating. It was a way of appreciating relationships more fully because he wasn't taking their permanence for granted. When loss inevitably came, he was prepared not because he cared less, but because he had practiced accepting impermanence as a fundamental feature of existence. Tomorrow, we'll explore what happens when your carefully constructed philosophical practice crumbles during genuine crisis. But for now, let yourself rest with the possibility that grief, like all experiences, can be met with both tenderness and wisdom. You've been practicing Stoic principles for months, maybe years. You've read the books, done the exercises, cultivated equanimity in small daily frustrations. You've felt proud of your philosophical progress, confident in your ability to handle whatever life throws at you. And then something happens that brings your entire practice crashing down like a house of cards in a hurricane. Welcome to the most humbling experience in philosophical development, discovering that your carefully constructed wisdom is no match for genuine crisis. Picture this scenario, because it happens to everyone who seriously attempts to live philosophically. You're hit with a perfect storm. Maybe a health crisis coincides with job loss, or a relationship ends just as financial problems mount, or a family emergency erupts while you're already stretched thin. Suddenly, all those Stoic principles that seemed so solid and practical feel like intellectual abstractions that have nothing to do with the raw reality of your situation. Your mind, which you thought you trained to remain rational and calm, starts spinning with anxiety, anger, and despair. Your emotions, which you believed you'd learn to observe without being overwhelmed by, flood through you with an intensity that makes your previous philosophical composure seem like a joke. You find yourself reacting in ways that contradict everything you thought you'd learned about virtue and wisdom. Here's a mainstream historical fact. that might provide some comfort. Even Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor himself, went through periods where his Stoic practice seemed to abandon him entirely. His private journals reveal moments of deep frustration, self-doubt, and what appears to be clinical depression. He wrote reminders to himself that read more like desperate attempts to regain his philosophical footing than confident expressions of wisdom. But here's something that might disturb you about Marcus Aurelius. Some historians suggest that during his darkest periods, he may have increased his use of theriac, an opium-based medicine that was supposedly for his stomach problems, but might have been his way of numbing emotional pain. Historians still argue whether this represents philosophical failure or simply human coping, but it reminds us that even the most dedicated practitioners sometimes need help beyond what philosophy alone can provide. The breakdown of your philosophical practice during crisis isn't a sign that Stoicism doesn't work. It's a sign that you're human. The ancient Stoics understood this better than modern self-help culture does. They never claimed that philosophical training would make you invulnerable to emotional overwhelm or guarantee that you'd always respond with perfect virtue. They claimed that practice would help you recover more quickly and respond more skillfully over time. Epictetus, who survived slavery and physical disability, taught that setbacks in philosophical practice were not only normal, but necessary for genuine development. He compared it to learning any complex skill. You don't expect to play piano perfectly after a few lessons, and you don't expect to maintain philosophical equanimity perfectly after reading a few books. The real test isn't whether you ever lose your composure, but whether you keep returning to your principles after you've lost your way. Here's a quirky historical detail that might make you smile. The Stoics actually had a technical term for philosophical backsliding, prokop, which meant progress that included setbacks and failures. They expected that students would regularly fall short of their ideals, and they built this expectation into their teaching methods. Modern perfectionism would have baffled them. So what do you do when your Stoic practice crumbles under pressure? First, you stop judging yourself for being human. The voice in your head that says, I should be handling this better, or all my philosophical study was worthless, is just another form of resistance to reality. You're experiencing exactly what you're experiencing, and adding self-criticism to genuine difficulty only makes things worse. Second, you remember that philosophical practice is like physical fitness. It atrophies when you don't use it, but it comes back more quickly than it developed initially. Just because you've lost your philosophical composure doesn't mean you've lost all the benefits of your previous practice. The neural pathways you've developed through meditation, reflection, and conscious response are still there, even if they're temporarily overwhelmed by stress hormones and emotional intensity. Third, you start small. You don't try to immediately return to your previous level of philosophical sophistication. Instead, you focus on the most basic practices, breathing consciously, noticing your thoughts without believing them automatically, taking one small action that aligns with your values. You treat yourself like someone recovering from an illness, which in many ways you are. Let's get practical about this. Maybe you've been practicing morning meditation for months, but during your crisis, you can't sit still for 5 minutes without your mind racing. Instead of abandoning the practice entirely, or forcing yourself through sessions that increase your agitation, you might try walking meditation or even just conscious breathing while you're stuck in traffic or waiting in line. Maybe you've been practicing the discipline of desire, wanting what happens rather than wanting what doesn't happen. But now you're consumed with wanting your circumstances to be different. Instead of pretending you don't have these desires, you might practice noticing them. I'm having a strong desire for this situation to be different. That's what's happening right now. The breakdown of philosophical practice also reveals something important about the difference between intellectual understanding and embodied wisdom. You can understand Stoic principles perfectly on a cognitive level and still find yourself completely unprepared for the emotional and physical reality of genuine crisis. This isn't a failure. It's information about where your practice needs to deepen. Modern neuroscience helps explain why philosophical practices can seem to disappear during crisis. When you're under extreme stress, your brain shifts into survival mode, prioritizing immediate threat response over higher order cognitive functions like philosophical reflection. The prefrontal cortex, where your rational thinking happens, literally goes offline when your amygdala perceives serious danger. This means that the philosophical practices that work during normal circumstances might be completely inaccessible during crisis. You need different tools for different levels of stress, basic grounding techniques for acute crisis, intermediate practices for moderate stress, and advanced philosophical work for times when you're relatively stable. But here's something the ancient Stoics understood that modern culture often misses. Sometimes the most philosophical thing you can do is admit that you need help beyond what philosophy can provide. Seneca had advisors and friends who supported him through difficult periods. Marcus Aurelius had physicians who treated his physical ailments. Epictetus had a community of fellow students and teachers who helped him develop his understanding. The myth of the self-sufficient philosophical sage who handles everything alone is just that, a myth. Real philosophical practice includes knowing when to seek support, whether that's professional therapy, medical treatment, spiritual guidance, or simply the comfort of friends who care about you. There's also something to be said for the humility that comes from having your philosophical practice humbled by reality. It's easy to become spiritually proud when your practices are working well, to feel superior to people who seem less emotionally regulated or philosophically sophisticated. Crisis has a way of reminding you that you're not as wise or strong as you thought, and this reminder can actually deepen your compassion for others who are struggling. Tomorrow, we'll explore how Stoic practice can sometimes create distance between you and the people you love most. But for now, if your philosophical practice has ever crumbled under pressure, know that you're in good company with every serious practitioner throughout history. You've been walking this Stoic path for a while now, and you've noticed something unexpected. Practicing philosophy isn't always a one-way ticket to deeper connection. Sometimes it can actually drive a wedge between you and the people you care about most. Tonight, let's talk honestly about the social cost of Stoicism, how trying to live wisely and virtuously can sometimes isolate you from friends, family, and even your own emotions. Picture this. You're at a family dinner and someone starts complaining about their boss. Normally, you'd jump in with empathy, maybe even share a story of your own. But now, after studying Stoicism, you find yourself thinking, They're focusing on what's outside their control. They should be more like Marcus Aurelius. Or maybe you're listening to a friend vent about a breakup, and instead of offering comfort, you're mentally drafting a lecture about emotional resilience and the discipline of desire. Suddenly, you realize you're not fully present with the people you love. You're analyzing their reactions instead of joining them in their experience. And if you ever try to share your philosophical insights, you might get blank stares, rolled eyes, or outright rejection. Why are you always so calm? You sound like a robot. Can't you just be human for once? Here's a mainstream historical fact that puts this in perspective. Seneca, one of the most famous Stoic teachers, wrote extensively about friendship and social bonds. He believed that philosophy should make you a better friend, not a more distant one. But even Seneca struggled with this balance. He was accused of hypocrisy because he preached simplicity while living in luxury, and his close relationship with the Emperor Nero ended in betrayal and tragedy. Historians still argue whether Seneca's philosophical ideals actually improved his relationships or just made them more complicated. But here's something that might surprise you. Some ancient Stoics were actually known for their warmth and humor. Epictetus, who could be stern in his teachings, was also famous for his wit and his ability to connect with students on a personal level. He understood that philosophy wasn't about becoming emotionally detached or intellectually superior. It was about becoming more fully human, more capable of genuine connection. The danger comes when you start using Stoic principles as a way to avoid vulnerability or to distance yourself from uncomfortable emotions. If you're always rising above your feelings or analyzing other people's reactions, you might miss the real, messy, beautiful experience of being in relationship with others. Let's get practical about this. Imagine you're at work and a colleague is visibly upset about a project that's gone wrong. The Stoic temptation might be to remind them that they can't control outcomes or to suggest that they're overreacting. But what they probably need in that moment is empathy, not a philosophy lesson. The most Stoic thing you can do might be to listen deeply, to share their frustration, and to offer support without trying to fix their emotions. Here's a quirky historical detail. The Stoics actually had a practice called the view from above, where they would imagine looking down on human affairs from a great height. This was meant to cultivate perspective and reduce attachment to petty concerns. But if you're always taking the view from above in your relationships, you might end up feeling disconnected from the people who matter most. The social cost of Stoicism isn't just about how others perceive you. It's also about how you perceive yourself. If you start to believe that being philosophical means being emotionally detached, you might suppress your own feelings in ways that harm your mental health and your relationships. The ancient Stoics never advocated emotional numbness. They advocated emotional intelligence, the ability to feel deeply without being controlled by your feelings. But there's a shadow side to this that the ancient texts don't always address directly. Sometimes the pursuit of wisdom can become a form of spiritual bypassing, using philosophy to avoid dealing with unresolved emotional pain or difficult conversations. Sometimes it can create a sense of superiority that isolates you from people who don't share your interests or values. The key is to remember that Stoicism at its best is about becoming more fully present in your life and relationships, not less. It's about developing the capacity to be with discomfort, your own and others, without trying to escape or fix it. It's about learning to listen deeply, to offer compassion, and to be vulnerable when appropriate. Let's apply this to a modern example. You're in a relationship, and your partner is upset about something that seems trivial to you. The Stoic temptation might be to dismiss their feelings as irrational, or to remind them that this too shall pass. But the most philosophical response might be to sit with them in their discomfort, to validate their experience, and to offer support without judgment. The Stoics also recognize that some relationships are toxic or harmful, and that it's sometimes necessary to create distance for your own well-being. But this is different from using philosophy as an excuse to avoid intimacy or to justify emotional withdrawal. Here's something most people don't realize about Stoic philosophy. It was originally taught in community. The early Stoics gathered in the Stoa Poikile, a public colonnade in Athens, where they discussed philosophy in the midst of everyday life. They didn't retreat to mountaintops or monasteries. They practiced philosophy in the messy reality of human relationships. The challenge for modern practitioners is to bring Stoic wisdom into your relationships without turning it into a barrier. This means being willing to be wrong, to apologize, to admit when you've been distant or judgmental. It means remembering that philosophy is a tool for living more fully, not an identity to defend or a standard to judge others by. Tomorrow, we'll explore how the Stoics approached anger, not as something to be eliminated, but as a teacher and a source of information. But for now, let yourself rest with the possibility that true wisdom might look less like detachment and more like deep, compassionate presence with the people you love. You've heard the advice, don't get angry. Maybe you've even tried to suppress your anger, thinking that's what Stoic philosophy is all about. But tonight, let's set the record straight. Anger, for the Stoics, wasn't just a problem to be eliminated. It was a teacher, a signal, and sometimes even a necessary force. The ancient Stoics had a much more nuanced relationship with anger than most people realize, and understanding their approach might help you work with your own difficult emotions. Picture yourself in a situation where someone treats you unfairly. Maybe a coworker takes credit for your work, or a friend betrays your trust, or a public official makes a decision that harms your community. Your body tenses, your pulse quickens, your face feels hot, anger rises in your chest, and your first instinct might be to judge yourself for feeling it. I should be more stoic, you think. I should just let it go. But here's what the ancient Stoics actually taught. Anger isn't something to be ashamed of or suppressed. It's a natural human response to perceived injustice or threat. The Stoics didn't want you to become emotionless. They wanted you to become emotionally intelligent, to use your anger as information rather than letting it control you. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Seneca wrote an entire book about anger called On Anger. In it, he explored the causes and consequences of anger, and he offered practical advice for working with it. Seneca recognized that anger can be destructive, but he also acknowledged its power and its role in human psychology. He didn't advocate eliminating anger. He advocated understanding it, channeling it, and using it wisely. But here's something that might surprise you. Seneca himself struggled with anger. He served as an advisor to Nero, one of Rome's most violent and unpredictable emperors, and he witnessed and sometimes participated in acts of cruelty and injustice. Historians still argue whether Seneca's philosophical writings on anger were a form of self-therapy or a genuine attempt to help others. But either way, his work reveals a deep personal engagement with the emotion. The Stoic approach to anger starts with recognition. When you feel angry, you notice it. You don't judge yourself for feeling it, and you don't immediately act on it. You pause. You observe the physical sensations, the thoughts, the impulses that arise with anger. You ask yourself, what is this anger telling me? What values or boundaries have been violated? What do I need to protect or restore? This is where the Stoics' practice of prosouche, continuous attention to the present moment, becomes essential. You're not trying to suppress or avoid anger. You're trying to be present with it, to understand it, and to choose your response rather than reacting automatically. Here's a quirky historical detail. The Stoics believed that anger could be a form of short madness, but they also recognized that it could be a catalyst for positive change. Marcus Aurelius, for example, wrote about using anger as a signal that something important was at stake, but he cautioned against letting anger dictate his actions or cloud his judgment. Let's get practical about this. Imagine you're in a meeting at work and someone interrupts you repeatedly, dismisses your ideas, and takes credit for your contributions. Your anger rises. The Stoic approach isn't to suppress your anger or to lash out in retaliation. It's to notice your anger, to recognize that it's signaling a boundary violation, and to choose a response that aligns with your values. Maybe you calmly assert yourself. Maybe you address the issue privately with the person later. Maybe you decide to let it go this time, but make a mental note to be more assertive in the future. The Stoics also recognize that anger often arises from unmet expectations. You expect people to treat you fairly, to respect your boundaries, to act with integrity. When they don't, you feel angry. The Stoic practice is to examine your expectations, to ask whether they're realistic, and to adjust them if necessary. This doesn't mean lowering your standards. It means recognizing that you can't control other people's behavior, only your own response. But here's something that makes this teaching uncomfortable for modern people. The Stoics sometimes minimize the role of systemic injustice in generating anger. They tended to focus on individual responsibility and self-control, which can feel dismissive if you're dealing with racism, sexism, or other forms of structural oppression. The ancient Stoics lived in a world where slavery was normal and women had limited rights, so their philosophy sometimes reflects the blind spots of their time. Historians still argue whether Stoic philosophy is flexible enough to address modern understandings of systemic injustice, or whether it's inherently limited by its focus on individual virtue. This is an open scholarly debate that continues to shape how people interpret and apply Stoic teachings today. The Stoic approach to anger also includes a practice called the discipline of assent. When you feel angry, you don't immediately believe the stories your mind creates about the situation. You pause. You question your assumptions. You consider alternative interpretations. You ask yourself, is this really as bad as it seems? Is my anger proportional to the situation? Is there another way to look at this? This practice helps you avoid the trap of catastrophizing, turning a minor offense into a major crisis. It also helps you avoid the trap of personalizing, assuming that someone's behavior is deliberately aimed at you, when it might just be thoughtless or the result of their own struggles. But there's a shadow side to the Stoic approach to anger that needs to be acknowledged. Sometimes the emphasis on self-control and rationality can become a way of suppressing legitimate anger, especially for people who have been socialized to avoid conflict or to prioritize others' comfort over their own needs. Sometimes anger is a necessary signal that something is wrong and needs to change. The key is to use anger as information, not as an excuse for harm. Anger can motivate you to set boundaries, to stand up for yourself, to advocate for justice, but it can also cloud your judgment, lead you to say or do things you regret, and damage your relationships. The Stoic practice is to harness the energy of anger while remaining clear-headed and values-driven. Seneca recommended a simple practice for working with anger. Delay. When you feel anger rising, wait before acting. Count to 10, take a walk, sleep on it. Often, the intensity of the emotion will fade, and you'll be able to respond more skillfully. Tomorrow, we'll explore how to maintain equanimity when everyone around you seems to be thriving while you're struggling. But for now, let yourself rest with the possibility that anger, like all emotions, can be a teacher if you're willing to listen. You're lying here in the quiet, and I want to talk to you about something that can feel especially bitter when you're in pain: comparison. Specifically, what happens when you're in the middle of your own struggles and everyone else seems to be thriving. The Stoics had a lot to say about comparison, and their insights might help you find a little more peace and a little less self-criticism when you're feeling left behind. Picture this. You open your social media feed, and there it is. Friends, acquaintances, even people you barely know, posting about promotions, vacations, new relationships, and personal triumphs. Meanwhile, you're dealing with setbacks, disappointments, or just the daily grind of keeping your head above water. The temptation to compare yourself, to wonder why everyone else seems to have it together while you're barely hanging on, can be overwhelming. The Stoics knew this feeling well, and they developed strategies for dealing with it that go deeper than just stay off social media. Let's start with a mainstream historical fact. Marcus Aurelius often wrote about comparison in his private journals, reminding himself not to envy others or judge himself by external standards. He lived in a world where social status, wealth, and reputation were everything, and he was surrounded by people who seemed to have more power, more success, or more happiness than he did. Yet he consistently returned to the idea that true worth comes from within, from your character and your choices, not from how you stack up against others. But here's something that might surprise you. Marcus Aurelius himself was constantly compared to his adoptive father, Emperor Antoninus Pius, and to other great leaders of the past. Historians still argue whether Marcus felt pressure to live up to these comparisons or whether he genuinely embraced the Stoic teaching that external achievements are ultimately indifferent. Either way, his writings reveal a man who struggled with comparison just like anyone else. The Stoic approach to comparison starts with a simple but profound shift. You stop measuring yourself against others and start measuring yourself against your own standards. Instead of asking, "Why am I not as successful as them?" you ask, "Am I living in alignment with my values? Am I making progress toward my own goals? Am I treating myself and others with respect and kindness?" This doesn't mean you ignore the reality of other people's achievements or pretend that you don't feel envy or insecurity. It means you recognize these feelings as natural human responses, but you don't let them dictate your self-worth or your actions. Here's a quirky historical detail. The Stoics actually had a practice called the view from above, where they would imagine looking down on human affairs from a great height. This perspective helped them see how small and temporary individual achievements and setbacks really are in the grand scheme of things. It's a bit like zooming out on a map. When you see the whole landscape, your own location seems less significant, and the differences between people seem less important. Let's get practical about this. Imagine you're at a reunion and everyone is sharing their latest accomplishments. You feel a pang of envy or inadequacy. The Stoic approach isn't to suppress these feelings or to pretend you're happy for everyone while secretly judging yourself. It's to notice your feelings, to acknowledge them without judgment, and to gently redirect your attention to your own journey. The Stoics also recognize that comparison is often based on incomplete information. You see other people's highlight reels, not their struggles, doubts, or failures. You compare your behind the scenes to everyone else's carefully curated public image. The Stoic practice is to remind yourself that everyone faces challenges, even if they don't show them, and that no one's life is as perfect as it appears from the outside. But here's something that makes this teaching uncomfortable for modern people. The Stoics sometimes minimize the role of privilege and systemic advantage in shaping people's outcomes. They tended to focus on individual responsibility and virtue, which can feel dismissive if you're dealing with real barriers to success. The ancient Stoics lived in a world where social status was largely determined by birth, and their philosophy sometimes reflects the limitations of their time. Historians still argue whether Stoic philosophy is flexible enough to address modern understandings of privilege and inequality, or whether it's inherently limited by its focus on individual control. This is an open scholarly debate that continues to shape how people interpret and apply Stoic teachings today. The Stoic approach to comparison also includes a practice called the discipline of desire. Instead of desiring what others have, you focus on wanting what you already have, or what is within your power to achieve. This doesn't mean you give up on your goals or stop striving for improvement. It means you measure your progress against your own starting point, not against someone else's finish line. Let's apply this to a modern example. You're working hard to pay off debt, and you see a friend posting about their new car or vacation. You feel a mix of envy and frustration. The Stoic approach is to notice these feelings, to acknowledge them without judgment, and to remind yourself that your journey is your own. You might ask yourself, am I making progress toward my own goals? Am I living in alignment with my values? Am I treating myself with kindness and respect? The Stoics also recognize that comparison can be a source of motivation if you use it wisely. Instead of envying others, you can be inspired by their achievements, learn from their example, and use their success as a reminder of what's possible. But the key is to keep the focus on your own growth, not on measuring yourself against someone else's standards. But there's a shadow side to the Stoic approach to comparison that needs to be acknowledged. Sometimes the emphasis on individual responsibility and internal standards can become a way of blaming yourself for circumstances that are largely outside your control. If you're dealing with systemic barriers, discrimination, or chronic illness, the suggestion that you should just focus on your own journey, can feel dismissive or even cruel. The key is to use Stoic practices as tools for self-compassion and self-improvement, not as weapons of self-criticism. You can acknowledge the reality of your circumstances, recognize the challenges you face, and still focus on what's within your control. You can celebrate your own progress, no matter how small, and remind yourself that comparison is a thief of joy. Tomorrow we'll explore how the Stoics approached physical pain, illness, and disability, topics that are especially relevant if you're dealing with chronic health challenges. But for now, let yourself rest with the possibility that your worth isn't determined by how you compare to others, but by how you live your own life, one day at a time. As you sink further into your pillow, let's talk about something that touches everyone sooner or later: physical pain, illness, and disability. The Stoics didn't shy away from these realities. In fact, they had some of the most practical and compassionate advice for dealing with bodily suffering long before modern medicine or pain management existed. Tonight, we'll explore what ancient philosophy can teach us about living well, even when our bodies refuse to cooperate. Picture yourself waking up with a headache or a sore back, or maybe you're dealing with something more serious: chronic pain, a lingering illness, or a disability that changes how you move through the world. Your first instinct might be frustration, anger, or even despair. Why is this happening to you? Why can't your body just do what it's supposed to do? The Stoics would say these are natural reactions, but they also offer a way forward that doesn't depend on your body being perfect. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Epictetus, one of the most influential Stoic teachers, walked with a limp for most of his life. Some ancient sources say his leg was broken while he was a slave, possibly as punishment or even as an experiment. Despite this, Epictetus became famous for his wisdom and his ability to teach others how to live well, regardless of their physical condition. He didn't let his disability define him, but he also didn't pretend it didn't matter. He simply found ways to work with it rather than against it. But here's something that might surprise you. The Stoics weren't just toughing it out or pretending pain didn't exist. They recognized that physical suffering is real and unavoidable for most people at some point in their lives. Their goal wasn't to eliminate pain, but to reduce the additional suffering we create through our thoughts about pain. Let's get practical about this. When you're in pain, your mind often starts spinning stories. This shouldn't be happening. I can't take this anymore. Why me? What if it gets worse? Each of these thoughts adds another layer of suffering to the original physical sensation. The Stoic practice is to notice these thoughts, to recognize them as mental events rather than facts, and to gently return your attention to the present moment. The Stoics also practiced what they called the discipline of assent. When you feel pain, you don't immediately believe the catastrophic stories your mind creates about it. You pause. You ask yourself, is this pain really as unbearable as my mind is telling me? Is there another way to relate to this experience? This doesn't mean you ignore pain or refuse to seek medical help. It means you don't let your thoughts about pain make the experience worse than it needs to be. Here's a quirky historical detail. The ancient Stoics were among the first to recognize the mind-body connection. They understood that physical pain is often amplified by emotional distress, and that calming the mind can sometimes reduce the intensity of physical suffering. They practiced breathing exercises, meditation, and other techniques that modern science now confirms can help manage pain. But here's something that makes this teaching uncomfortable for modern people. The Stoics sometimes minimize the reality of chronic illness or disability, focusing instead on the power of the mind to overcome physical limitations. This can feel dismissive if you're dealing with a condition that can't be managed with positive thinking or willpower alone. The ancient Stoics lived in a world without modern medicine, painkillers, or disability accommodations, so their philosophy sometimes reflects the limitations of their time. Historians still argue whether Stoic philosophy is flexible enough to address the full complexity of chronic illness and disability, or whether it's inherently limited by its focus on individual resilience. This is an open scholarly debate that continues to shape how people interpret and apply Stoic teachings today. The Stoic approach to physical pain also includes a practice called voluntary discomfort, which we discussed earlier. By occasionally choosing to experience mild discomfort, cold showers, fasting, sleeping on a hard surface, you build resilience for times when discomfort is imposed on you by illness or injury. This isn't about punishing yourself or pretending pain doesn't matter. It's about training your mind to remain stable even when your body is suffering. Let's apply this to a modern example. You're dealing with a chronic condition that causes daily pain. The Stoic approach isn't to ignore the pain or to pretend you're fine. It's to acknowledge the reality of your experience, to seek appropriate medical care, and to practice accepting what you can't change while focusing on what you can control: your attitude, your daily habits, and your relationships. The Stoics also recognize that illness and disability can be opportunities to develop virtues like patience, courage, and compassion. When you're forced to slow down, to ask for help, or to accept your limitations, you have a chance to grow in ways that might not be possible when everything is going smoothly. This doesn't mean you should be grateful for illness or disability, but it does mean you can find meaning and growth even in difficult circumstances. But there's a shadow side to the Stoic approach to physical pain that needs to be acknowledged. Sometimes the emphasis on resilience and acceptance can become a way of denying the reality of suffering or avoiding necessary self-care. If you're dealing with chronic pain or illness, it's important to listen to your body, to seek support, and to acknowledge when you need rest or help. The key is to use Stoic practices as tools for self-compassion and self-management, not as weapons of self-criticism. You can acknowledge the reality of your pain, recognize the challenges you face, and still focus on what's within your control. You can celebrate small victories, practice gratitude for moments of relief, and remind yourself that your worth isn't determined by your physical condition. Tomorrow, we'll explore how the Stoics approach death, not as something to fear, but as a natural part of life that can help us live more fully. But for now, let yourself rest with the possibility that even in pain, there are ways to find peace and meaning. Tonight, as you settle deeper into the quiet, let's talk about something that touches every life, and yet most of us spend our days pretending it will never happen: death. The Stoics didn't shy away from this topic. In fact, they believed that thinking about death was essential for living well. Their approach wasn't morbid or fearful, but practical, honest, and surprisingly comforting. Picture yourself lying here, listening to this, and imagine that tonight is your last night. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but simply as a thought experiment. How would you feel? What would you regret? What would you wish you had done differently? The Stoics called this practice memento mori. Remember that you must die. And it wasn't meant to scare you, but to wake you up to the preciousness of your life. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Marcus Aurelius, surrounded by the luxury and power of the Roman Empire, wrote about death almost daily in his private journals. He reminded himself that everyone he admired, everyone he envied, everyone he loved would one day be dust. This wasn't a cause for despair, but a reminder to focus on what truly mattered, living with integrity, kindness, and purpose. But here's something that might surprise you. The Stoics weren't just talking about death in the abstract. They lived in a world where death was a constant presence. Infant mortality was high, life expectancy was low, and sudden illness or violence could end a life at any moment. When they wrote about accepting death, they were speaking from experience, not theory. Let's get practical about this. The practice of memento mori isn't about obsessing over death or living in fear. It's about using the awareness of your mortality to clarify your priorities and to let go of petty concerns. When you remember that your time is limited, you're less likely to waste it on anger, envy, or trivial distractions. You're more likely to focus on what truly matters to you, your relationships, your values, your legacy. The Stoics also practiced what they called the discipline of desire. Instead of desiring immortality or clinging to life at all costs, they learned to want what is natural and inevitable. They accepted that death is part of the cycle of life, and that resisting it only creates unnecessary suffering. Here's a quirky historical detail. Some ancient Stoics, like Seneca, actually practiced death rehearsals. They would set aside time to imagine their own deaths, to reflect on their lives, and to prepare themselves emotionally for the end. Seneca wrote about this as a way to reduce fear and to live more fully in the present. He believed that rehearsing death made him less afraid of it and more appreciative of each day. But here's something that makes this teaching uncomfortable for modern people. The Stoics didn't offer comforting beliefs about an afterlife. They didn't promise that you would be reunited with loved ones or that your suffering would be rewarded. They simply said that death is natural, inevitable, and not to be feared. This can feel stark or even harsh if you're used to religious or spiritual ideas about what happens after death. Historians still argue whether the Stoics were too dismissive of the emotional comfort that afterlife beliefs can provide, or whether their honesty about mortality was actually more empowering in the long run. This is an open scholarly debate that continues to shape how people interpret and apply Stoic teachings today. The Stoic approach to death also includes a practice called the view from above. When you imagine looking down on your life from a great height, you see how small and temporary your struggles and achievements really are. This perspective can help you let go of ego, reduce anxiety, and focus on what truly matters. Let's apply this to a modern example. You're lying in bed, worrying about a problem at work or a conflict with a friend. The practice of memento mori would be to remind yourself that, in the grand scheme of things, this problem is temporary. When you imagine yourself on your deathbed looking back, would this issue still matter? Would you regret spending so much energy on it? Or would you wish you had focused on love, connection, and kindness? The Stoics also recognize that thinking about death can be a powerful motivator for change. When you remember that your time is limited, you're more likely to take risks, to forgive, to apologize, to express your feelings, to pursue your dreams. You're less likely to postpone joy or to hold on to grudges. But there's a shadow side to the Stoic approach to death that needs to be acknowledged. Sometimes the emphasis on accepting mortality can become a way of avoiding grief or denying the depth of loss. If you're dealing with the death of someone you love, it's important to allow yourself to feel the pain, to mourn, and to honor your relationship. The Stoics didn't advocate emotional numbness. They advocated emotional intelligence, the ability to feel deeply without being overwhelmed. The key is to use the awareness of death as a tool for living more fully, not as a way to avoid the reality of loss. You can acknowledge the pain of mortality and still find meaning, purpose, and joy in your life. You can celebrate the time you have, cherish your relationships, and focus on what truly matters to you. Tomorrow we'll explore how the Stoics approached injustice, how to maintain virtue in a world that often rewards corruption and cruelty. But for now, let yourself rest with the possibility that remembering your mortality might be the key to living a richer, more meaningful life. You're lying here in bed, maybe thinking about the state of the world, the corruption, the cruelty, the unfairness that seems to be everywhere. How do you hold on to your values when it feels like the system is rigged against you? How do you keep doing the right thing when everyone around you is cutting corners, lying, or looking out for themselves? Tonight, let's talk about injustice, what it means to be virtuous in an unfair world, according to the Stoics. Picture yourself at work or in your community, or even just scrolling through the news. You see people getting ahead by cheating, by exploiting others, by manipulating the rules. You see good people being overlooked, ignored, or even punished for trying to do the right thing. Your first instinct might be anger, frustration, or even despair. Why bother being honest, kind, or fair when it seems like the world rewards the opposite? Here's a mainstream historical fact. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire that was rife with corruption, nepotism, and violence. He was surrounded by senators who lied, generals who betrayed, and officials who abused their power. Yet he consistently returned to the idea that true worth comes from within, from your character and your choices, not from external rewards or recognition. But here's something that might surprise you. Marcus Aurelius himself wasn't always able to root out corruption or punish wrongdoing. He often had to compromise, to work with people he didn't trust, to make decisions that left him conflicted. Historians still argue whether he was too idealistic or too pragmatic, but his writings reveal a man who struggled with the tension between his ideals and the realities of power. The Stoic approach to injustice starts with a simple but profound shift. You focus on what you can control, your own actions, your own attitudes, your own integrity. You can't always change the system, but you can always choose how you respond to it. You can't always prevent others from acting unjustly, but you can always decide not to participate in injustice yourself. This doesn't mean you become passive or resigned. The Stoics were far from passive. They believed in standing up for what's right, in speaking truth to power, in doing your part to make the world better. But they also recognized that you can't control outcomes, and that sometimes, despite your best efforts, injustice will prevail. Let's get practical about this. Imagine you're at work and you see a colleague taking credit for your ideas or lying to get ahead. The Stoic approach isn't to ignore it or to retaliate. It's to act with integrity, to speak up when appropriate, and to accept that you can't always change other people's behavior. You might not get the recognition or reward you deserve, but you'll know that you acted in alignment with your values. Here's a quirky historical detail. The Stoics actually had a concept called the inner citadel. They imagined that each person has an inner fortress where their true self resides, safe from external harm. No matter what happens in the outside world, no one can take away your integrity, your courage, or your ability to choose your response. This inner citadel becomes your refuge when the world feels unfair or chaotic. But here's something that makes this teaching uncomfortable for modern people. The Stoics sometimes minimize the role of systemic injustice, focusing instead on individual responsibility and virtue. This can feel dismissive if you're dealing with racism, sexism, or other forms of structural oppression. The ancient Stoics lived in a world where slavery was normal and women had limited rights, so their philosophy sometimes reflects the blind spots of their time. Historians still argue whether Stoic philosophy is flexible enough to address modern understandings of systemic injustice, or whether it's inherently limited by its focus on individual control. This is an open scholarly debate that continues to shape how people interpret and apply Stoic teachings today. The Stoic approach to injustice also includes a practice called the discipline of assent. When you witness injustice, you don't immediately believe the stories your mind creates about it. You pause. You ask yourself, is this really as hopeless as it seems? Is there something I can do, even in a small way, to make things better? Is there a way to respond that aligns with my values? This practice helps you avoid the trap of cynicism or despair. It reminds you that even in an unfair world, you have agency. You can choose to be honest, kind, and fair, even when others aren't. You can choose to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. You can choose to support others who are being treated unjustly, even if it costs you something. Let's apply this to a modern example. You're scrolling through the news and you see yet another story about corruption, inequality, or abuse of power. You feel angry, frustrated, or hopeless. The Stoic approach is to notice these feelings, to acknowledge them without judgment, and to ask yourself, what can I do right now to make a difference? How can I act with integrity in my own life? How can I support others who are facing injustice? The Stoics also recognize that injustice can be an opportunity to develop virtues like courage, compassion, and resilience. When you stand up for what's right, even in the face of opposition, you grow stronger. When you support others who are being treated unfairly, you deepen your sense of connection and purpose. But there's a shadow side to the Stoic approach to injustice that needs to be acknowledged. Sometimes, the emphasis on individual responsibility and inner virtue can become a way of avoiding necessary action or justifying inaction. If you're dealing with systemic injustice, the suggestion that you should just focus on your own integrity can feel like a cop-out. The key is to use Stoic practices as tools for empowerment, not as excuses for passivity. You can acknowledge the reality of injustice, recognize the challenges you face, and still focus on what's within your control. You can celebrate small acts of courage, practice gratitude for moments of fairness, and remind yourself that your worth isn't determined by the world's response to your actions. Tomorrow, we'll explore how the Stoics approached loneliness. What happens when doing the right thing leaves you isolated from community and belonging. But for now, let yourself rest with the possibility that even in an unfair world, you can find meaning and purpose by living with integrity. You're settling in for the night, and I want to talk to you about something that doesn't get discussed nearly enough: loneliness. Not just the feeling of being alone, but the deeper sense of isolation that can come from trying to live with integrity in a world that doesn't always reward it. The Stoics understood this experience well, and their insights might help you find meaning and connection even when you feel like you're standing apart from the crowd. Picture yourself making a difficult choice. Maybe you refuse to participate in something unethical at work, or you stand up for a principle that others ignore, or you simply choose to be honest when it would be easier to lie. You do the right thing, but instead of feeling supported, you find yourself alone. Your colleagues might distance themselves, your friends might not understand, or you might feel disconnected from the values of the people around you. This is the loneliness of virtue, and it's a real and painful experience. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Marcus Aurelius often wrote about feeling alone, even as emperor. Surrounded by advisors, generals, and courtiers, he still felt isolated in his commitment to philosophy and virtue. He reminded himself that true companionship comes from within, from his own principles and his relationship with himself, rather than from external validation or approval. But here's something that might surprise you. The Stoics didn't see loneliness as a failure or a sign of weakness. They saw it as a natural consequence of living with integrity in an imperfect world. They believed that true belonging comes from aligning with your own values, even if it means standing apart from others. Let's get practical about this. When you feel lonely because of your choices or your values, the Stoic approach isn't to change yourself to fit in. It's to recognize the feeling, to accept it as a natural response, and to find ways to connect with yourself and with others who share your principles. Here's a quirky historical detail. The Stoics actually had a practice called the Fellowship of the Wise. They imagined that even if they were physically alone, they were never truly isolated because they were part of a timeless community of people who valued wisdom, courage, and justice. This idea helped them feel connected to something larger than themselves, even when their immediate environment felt alienating. But here's something that makes this teaching uncomfortable for modern people. The Stoics sometimes minimize the importance of real human connection. They tended to focus on inner strength and self-sufficiency, which can feel dismissive if you're longing for genuine companionship or support. The ancient Stoics lived in a world where social bonds were often based on duty or necessity, rather than emotional intimacy. So their philosophy sometimes reflects the limitations of their time. Historians still argue whether Stoic philosophy is flexible enough to address the full complexity of human loneliness, or whether it's inherently limited by its focus on individual resilience. This is an open scholarly debate that continues to shape how people interpret and apply Stoic teachings today. The Stoic approach to loneliness also includes a practice called the discipline of desire. Instead of desiring approval or belonging at any cost, you learn to want what is truly good for you: authentic connection, meaningful relationships, and a sense of purpose that comes from living in alignment with your values. Let's apply this to a modern example. You're at a social gathering and everyone is gossiping or making fun of someone who isn't there. You choose not to participate, and suddenly you feel left out. The Stoic approach is to notice your discomfort, to acknowledge your longing for belonging, and to remind yourself that true connection comes from being authentic, not from fitting in. The Stoics also recognize that loneliness can be an opportunity to deepen your relationship with yourself. When you're alone, you have space to reflect, to clarify your values, and to practice self-compassion. You can use solitude as a time to recharge, to grow, and to prepare yourself for more meaningful connections in the future. But there is a shadow side to the Stoic approach to loneliness that needs to be acknowledged. Sometimes the emphasis on self-sufficiency and inner strength can become a way of avoiding vulnerability or justifying emotional withdrawal. If you're dealing with chronic loneliness or social isolation, it's important to seek out real connection, to reach out to others, and to allow yourself to be seen and supported. The key is to use Stoic practices as tools for self-understanding and empowerment, not as excuses for isolation. You can acknowledge the reality of loneliness, recognize the challenges you face, and still focus on what's within your control. You can celebrate small acts of courage, practice gratitude for moments of connection, and remind yourself that your worth isn't determined by how many people are around you. Tomorrow, we'll explore how the Stoics approached family suffering. What happens when the people you care about most make destructive choices you can't change. But for now, let yourself rest with the possibility that even in loneliness, you can find meaning, strength, and a deeper connection to yourself. You're lying here in the hush of night, and I want to talk about one of the hardest things any of us will ever face: family suffering. Not just your own pain, but the pain of watching someone you love make destructive choices, struggle with addiction, or spiral into self-destruction. The Stoics knew this anguish well, and their philosophy offers practical guidance for how to stay sane, loving, and virtuous when you're powerless to change the people who matter most to you. Picture yourself sitting at the kitchen table, watching a family member, maybe a parent, a sibling, or a child, repeat the same painful patterns. You've tried talking, pleading, reasoning, and even stepping back, but nothing seems to help. You feel a mix of love, frustration, fear, and helplessness. The Stoics would say this is one of the most challenging tests of wisdom and virtue, learning to care deeply without being consumed by what you can't control. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Marcus Aurelius lost several children to illness and political violence, and he also had to deal with family members who made poor choices. His adopted son, Commodus, became one of Rome's most infamous emperors, reckless, violent, and ultimately disastrous for the empire. Marcus wrote extensively about the limits of his influence, reminding himself that he could only control his own actions, not the choices of others, even those he loved most. But here's something that might surprise you. The Stoics didn't advocate detachment or emotional coldness toward family. They believed in loving fully, but they also recognized that true love sometimes means letting go of the illusion that you can fix or save another person. They called this the discipline of desire, learning to want what is possible rather than torturing yourself with impossible hopes. Let's get practical about this. When someone you love is suffering or making destructive choices. The Stoic approach isn't to give up or to distance yourself emotionally. It's to focus on what you can control, your own behavior, your own boundaries, and your own emotional responses. You can offer support, set healthy limits, and model the values you believe in, but you can't force someone else to change. Here's a quirky historical detail. The Stoics actually had a concept called the art of accompaniment. They believe that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is simply to be present with someone in their suffering without trying to fix or control their experience. This doesn't mean enabling harmful behavior, but it does mean offering compassion and understanding, even when you can't offer solutions. But here's something that makes this teaching uncomfortable for modern people. The Stoics sometimes minimize the emotional complexity of family relationships. They tended to focus on individual responsibility and virtue, which can feel dismissive if you're dealing with addiction, mental illness, or generational trauma. The ancient Stoics lived in a world where family roles were strictly defined and emotional expression was often suppressed, so their philosophy sometimes reflects the limitations of their time. Historians still argue whether Stoic philosophy is flexible enough to address the full complexity of family suffering, or whether it's inherently limited by its focus on individual control. This is an open scholarly debate that continues to shape how people interpret and apply Stoic teachings today. The Stoic approach to family suffering also includes a practice called the view from above. When you're overwhelmed by the pain of a loved one's choices, you can imagine looking down on your situation from a great height. This perspective helps you see that you're not alone, that countless people throughout history have faced similar challenges, and that your suffering is part of the larger human experience. Let's apply this to a modern example. You're worried about a family member who is struggling with addiction. You've tried everything: talking, ultimatums, support groups, but nothing has worked. The Stoic approach is to notice your feelings of helplessness and frustration, to acknowledge them without judgment, and to focus on what you can control: your own boundaries, your own self-care, and your own ability to offer love without enabling harmful behavior. The Stoics also recognize that family suffering can be an opportunity to develop virtues like patience, compassion, and resilience. When you love someone who is struggling, you have a chance to practice unconditional love, to set healthy boundaries, and to find meaning in the midst of pain. But there's a shadow side to the Stoic approach to family suffering that needs to be acknowledged. Sometimes the emphasis on acceptance and self-control can become a way of avoiding necessary action or justifying emotional withdrawal. If you're dealing with abuse or serious harm, it's important to protect yourself and others, even if it means making difficult choices. The key is to use Stoic practices as tools for self-care and empowerment, not as excuses for inaction or denial. You can acknowledge the reality of your loved one's suffering, recognize the limits of your control, and still focus on what's within your power. You can celebrate small moments of connection, practice gratitude for the love you share, and remind yourself that your worth isn't determined by your ability to fix someone else. Tomorrow we'll explore how the Stoics approached professional ethics. What happens when your livelihood depends on compromising your values? But for now, let yourself rest with the possibility that even in the face of family suffering, you can find meaning, strength, and a deeper capacity for love. You're lying here in the quiet, and I want to talk about a challenge that hits close to home for almost everyone: professional ethics. What do you do when your job, your paycheck, your security, or even your reputation depend on compromising your values? The Stoics face this dilemma too, and their approach offers a practical, if sometimes uncomfortable, way to navigate the gray areas of work and responsibility. Picture yourself in a meeting where your boss asks you to do something that feels wrong. Maybe fudge the numbers, mislead a client, or look the other way when a colleague crosses a line. You need this job. You have bills to pay, maybe a family to support. Saying no could mean losing your position, your income, or even your standing in your industry. The Stoics would say this is one of the most difficult tests of character, choosing between external security and inner integrity. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Seneca, one of the most famous Stoic philosophers, served as an advisor to Emperor Nero, one of history's most notorious tyrants. Seneca amassed enormous wealth and influence in this role, but he also witnessed and sometimes participated in acts of cruelty and injustice. He wrote about the tension between power and principle, about the compromises required to survive in positions of authority, and about the importance of maintaining your inner compass, even when the external world is corrupt. But here's something that might surprise you. Seneca was eventually ordered to take his own life after falling out of favor with Nero. His philosophical writings on integrity and courage were tested in the most extreme way possible. Historians still argue whether Seneca was a hypocrite for serving Nero while preaching virtue, or whether his life demonstrates the real-world complexity of ethical decision-making. Let's get practical about this. When you're faced with a professional ethical dilemma, the Stoic approach isn't to pretend the choice is easy or to judge yourself for feeling conflicted. It's to recognize the reality of your situation, to clarify your values, and to make the best decision you can with the information and resources you have. Here's a quirky historical detail. The Stoics actually had a concept called the art of living. They believed that philosophy wasn't just for contemplation. It was a practical guide for making difficult choices in everyday life. They encouraged their students to prepare for ethical challenges by imagining worst-case scenarios and rehearsing their responses. This wasn't about being pessimistic, but about being ready to act with integrity when the moment came. But here's something that makes this teaching uncomfortable for modern people. The Stoics sometimes minimize the real-world consequences of standing up for your principles. They tended to focus on inner virtue and self-respect, which can feel abstract or even privileged if you're facing unemployment, poverty, or retaliation for speaking out. The ancient Stoics lived in a world where social safety nets were non-existent and professional options were limited, so their philosophy sometimes reflects the limitations of their time. Historians still argue whether Stoic philosophy is flexible enough to address the full complexity of modern professional ethics, or whether it's inherently limited by its focus on individual responsibility. This is an open scholarly debate that continues to shape how people interpret and apply Stoic teachings today. The Stoic approach to professional ethics also includes a practice called the discipline of assent. When you're pressured to compromise your values, you don't immediately give in or react impulsively. You pause. You ask yourself, is this really necessary? Is there another way? What would I want my younger self or my children to see me do? This practice helps you avoid rationalizing unethical behavior or blaming external circumstances for your choices. Let's apply this to a modern example. You're asked to sign off on a report that you know contains misleading information. The Stoic approach is to notice your discomfort, to acknowledge your fear of consequences, and to consider your options. You might decide to speak up, to seek advice, or to quietly look for another job. The key is to make your decision consciously, based on your values, rather than out of habit or fear. The Stoics also recognize that professional challenges can be opportunities to develop virtues like courage, honesty, and resilience. When you stand up for what's right, even when it's hard, you grow stronger. When you admit your mistakes or acknowledge your limitations, you build trust and self-respect. But there's a shadow side to the Stoic approach to professional ethics that needs to be acknowledged. Sometimes the emphasis on inner virtue and self-respect can become a way of blaming yourself for circumstances that are largely beyond your control. If you're dealing with systemic corruption, exploitation, or discrimination, the suggestion that you should just focus on your own integrity can feel like a cop-out. The key is to use Stoic practices as tools for empowerment, not as excuses for inaction or self-criticism. You can acknowledge the reality of your situation, recognize the challenges you face, and still focus on what's within your control. You can celebrate small acts of courage, practice gratitude for moments of fairness, and remind yourself that your worth isn't determined by your job or your paycheck. Tomorrow, we'll explore what happens when your philosophical practice itself becomes a burden, when trying to live virtuously feels like just another impossible standard to maintain. But for now, let yourself rest with the possibility that even in the messy world of work, you can find meaning, dignity, and a deeper sense of purpose. You're lying here, maybe feeling the weight of all these philosophical practices. You've been trying to be virtuous, to accept what you can't change, to focus on what's in your control. But sometimes it all just feels like too much. The very philosophy that's supposed to help you can start to feel like just another burden, another impossible standard you'll never live up to. Tonight, let's talk about Stoic exhaustion. What happens when your practice becomes another source of stress instead of relief? Picture yourself at the end of a long day. You're tired, maybe frustrated, or disappointed with yourself. You think about all the ways you fell short of your ideals. Maybe you lost your temper, gave in to temptation, or failed to speak up when you should have. Instead of feeling inspired by your philosophy, you feel weighed down by it. Why can't I just get this right? You might ask yourself. Why is it so hard to be virtuous? Here's a mainstream historical fact. Even Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, experienced moments of exhaustion and self-doubt. His private journals are filled with reminders to himself not to give up, not to lose heart, not to expect perfection. He wrote about the importance of returning to his principles after setbacks, of treating himself with kindness, and of recognizing that progress is more important than perfection. But here's something that might surprise you. The Stoics didn't expect you to be a saint. They expected you to struggle, to fail, to get discouraged. They called this procup, progress that includes setbacks and failures. They believe that real growth comes not from never falling, but from always getting back up. Let's get practical about this. When your philosophical practice starts to feel like a burden. The Stoic approach isn't to double down or to judge yourself for struggling. It's to pause, to notice your feelings, and to treat yourself with the same compassion you'd offer a friend who's trying their best. Here's a quirky historical detail. The Stoics actually had a practice called the evening review. At the end of each day, they would reflect on their actions, not to beat themselves up for their mistakes, but to learn from them and to prepare for a better tomorrow. They recognized that self-criticism is only useful if it leads to growth, not if it becomes a form of self-punishment. But here's something that makes this teaching uncomfortable for modern people. The Stoics sometimes minimized the importance of rest and self-care. They tended to focus on discipline and effort, which can feel relentless if you're already stretched thin. The ancient Stoics lived in a world where survival often depended on constant vigilance, so their philosophy sometimes reflects the limitations of their time. Historians still argue whether Stoic philosophy is flexible enough to address the realities of modern burnout and mental health, or whether it's inherently limited by its focus on individual responsibility. This is an open scholarly debate that continues to shape how people interpret and apply Stoic teachings today. The Stoic approach to exhaustion also includes a practice called the discipline of desire. Instead of desiring perfection or effortless virtue, you learn to want progress, learning, and self-compassion. You recognize that the goal isn't to never struggle, but to keep returning to your principles, even when it's hard. Let's apply this to a modern example. You've had a rough week at work, and you snap at a colleague or indulge in a habit you're trying to break. Instead of spiraling into self-criticism, the Stoic approach is to notice what happened, to reflect on what triggered your reaction, and to make a plan for how you'll respond differently next time. You remind yourself that setbacks are part of the process and that each day is a new opportunity to practice. The Stoics also recognize that sometimes the most philosophical thing you can do is to rest. When you're exhausted, pushing yourself harder usually leads to more mistakes and more frustration. Taking a break, practicing self-care, and giving yourself permission to be imperfect can actually help you return to your practice with renewed energy and clarity. But there's a shadow side to the Stoic approach to exhaustion that needs to be acknowledged. Sometimes the emphasis on discipline and effort can become a way of denying your own limits or justifying unsustainable habits. If you're dealing with chronic stress, burnout, or mental health challenges, it's important to seek support, to prioritize your well-being, and to recognize that rest is not a failure. The key is to use Stoic practices as tools for self-compassion and growth, not as weapons of self-criticism. You can acknowledge your exhaustion, recognize the challenges you face, and still focus on what's within your control. You can celebrate small acts of kindness to yourself, practice gratitude for moments of rest, and remind yourself that your worth isn't determined by how perfectly you live up to your ideals. Tomorrow, we'll explore how to live philosophically in an unstoic world, how to integrate Stoic wisdom into your daily life without becoming either a hypocrite or a hermit. But for now, let yourself rest with the possibility that even exhaustion can be a teacher if you're willing to listen. You're lying here, probably feeling the weight of all these ideas about suffering, loss, integrity, exhaustion, and everything in between. You might be wondering, how do I actually live this stuff? How do I take Stoic philosophy off the page and into my messy, imperfect, unstoic life? Tonight, let's talk about integration, how to live philosophically in a world that rarely rewards it, and how to do so without becoming either a hypocrite or a hermit. Picture yourself tomorrow morning, waking up to the same old world. The news is still full of chaos. Your inbox is still full of demands, and your heart is still full of hopes and fears. You're not a philosopher king or a sage on a mountaintop. You're just you, trying to make sense of it all. The Stoics knew this feeling well. Their philosophy wasn't designed for perfect people in perfect circumstances. It was designed for real people in the real world, with all its contradictions and complexities. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Marcus Aurelius didn't spend his days in serene contemplation. He was constantly pulled in 1,000 directions, dealing with war, plague, political intrigue, and personal loss. He wrote his most famous work, Meditations, not as a polished treatise for public consumption, but as private notes to himself, reminders of how to stay grounded in the midst of chaos. But here's something that might surprise you. Marcus wasn't always successful. He made mistakes. He lost his temper. He doubted himself. He struggled with the gap between his ideals and his reality. Historians still argue whether he was a truly great emperor or just a well-intentioned man doing his best in impossible circumstances. Either way, his life reminds us that Stoicism is a practice, not a performance. Let's get practical about this. When you're trying to live philosophically in an unstoic world, the goal isn't to become a perfect stoic. It's to become a little more aware, a little more intentional, a little more resilient, one day at a time. You don't have to eliminate all your flaws or solve all your problems. You just have to keep showing up, keep practicing, keep learning from your mistakes. Here's a quirky historical detail. The Stoics actually had a saying, progress, not perfection. They recognized that real growth is slow, uneven, and often invisible to others. They valued consistency over dramatic breakthroughs, and they celebrated small acts of courage and kindness as much as grand gestures. But here's something that makes this teaching uncomfortable for modern people. The Stoics sometimes minimized the importance of community and support. They tended to focus on individual effort and self-reliance, which can feel isolating if you're trying to change your life in a world that doesn't always value wisdom or virtue. The ancient Stoics lived in a world where philosophy was often a communal activity, but their writings sometimes reflect the limitations of their time. Historians still argue whether Stoic philosophy is flexible enough to address the realities of modern life, or whether it's inherently limited by its focus on individual control. This is an open scholarly debate that continues to shape how people interpret and apply Stoic teachings today. The Stoic approach to integration also includes a practice called the art of living. Instead of treating philosophy as a set of rules or a checklist, you learn to weave it into your daily life, your conversations, your work, your relationships, your self-talk. You don't have to announce your philosophical commitments to the world. You just have to live them quietly and consistently in the choices you make every day. Let's apply this to a modern example. You're at a party and someone starts gossiping about a mutual friend. The Stoic approach isn't to lecture everyone about virtue or to judge yourself for feeling tempted to join in. It's to notice your reaction, to choose your response based on your values, and to move on without making a big deal about it. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be intentional. The Stoics also recognize that integration is a lifelong process. You'll have good days and bad days, moments of clarity and moments of confusion. The key is to keep returning to your principles, to keep learning from your experiences, and to keep treating yourself and others with kindness and respect. But there's a shadow side to the Stoic approach to integration that needs to be acknowledged. Sometimes the emphasis on individual effort and self-reliance can become a way of avoiding vulnerability or justifying isolation. If you're trying to change your life, it's important to seek out support, to share your struggles, and to allow yourself to be seen and helped. The key is to use Stoic practices as tools for growth and connection, not as excuses for perfectionism or isolation. You can acknowledge your imperfections, recognize the challenges you face, and still focus on what's within your control. You can celebrate small acts of courage, practice gratitude for moments of clarity, and remind yourself that your worth isn't determined by how perfectly you live up to your ideals. Now, as you drift towards sleep, remember that Stoicism isn't about becoming someone else. It's about becoming more fully yourself, more aware, more intentional, more resilient. It's about learning to dance with reality rather than fighting it or running from it. And it's about finding meaning and purpose, not in some distant ideal, but in the messy, beautiful, imperfect life you're living right now. And so, as the night deepens and your thoughts slow, let yourself settle into the gentle rhythm of your breath. The journey we've taken together through suffering, loss, anger, exhaustion, and the quiet struggle to live with integrity has been long, but it's brought you here, to this moment, in this bed, in this body, alive and awake to the possibilities of your own life. Imagine the weight of the day lifting, as if each exhale carries away a little more tension, a little more worry. The lessons of the Stoics are not demands to be perfect, but invitations to be present, to notice, to accept, to choose, and to keep choosing, even when it's hard. You are not expected to master all of this at once. You are only asked to try, to learn, to fall, and to rise again. Tonight, let yourself rest in the knowledge that you are enough, just as you are. Your struggles do not define you. Your willingness to face them does. Your imperfections are not failures. They are the raw material of your growth. The world outside may be chaotic, but within you, there is a quiet center, a place of calm, of clarity, of courage. As you drift towards sleep, picture yourself standing on a shore at dawn. The waves come and go, each one different, each one part of the same endless rhythm. You cannot stop the tide, but you can learn to stand firm, to breathe, to let each wave pass through you without sweeping you away. This is the essence of Stoic wisdom, not to control the ocean, but to learn to swim. Let your breath slow, let your mind soften, let your heart open. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new joys, new opportunities to practice. But for now, let yourself rest. You have done enough. You are enough. The journey continues, but tonight, let yourself be at peace.